on this game. Now again, these are cheap cards for the most part. A lot of these cards you can get for even like 4 or 5,000 NT. Now again, some of these cards like Reynad, like even a Caruso might be a little more expensive. But again, wait for a pack drop, maybe super packs. And again, those prices are going to go down by quite a bit. That is going to wrap it up for our video today. Let me know your thoughts on it down below in the comments, guys. Caruso might be a little more expensive, but again, wait for a pack drop, maybe super packs. And again, those prices, these cards like Reynad, like even a Caruso might be a little more expensive, but again, wait for a pack drop, maybe super packs. And again, those prices are going to go down by quite a bit. That is going to wrap it up for our video today. Let me know. Good times, it's gonna be some good times. Man, we used to pull up and let them fight at that hood time. Remember I used to when it was about that. If that little walk up tripping, she get that much time. I don't waste time. I don't have patience, babe. Didn't go fast, she speed racing. We go wild out to bedtime. She my boss like a grandson. Come here, babe, I'm molested. I let her write me my suggestions. Pop quiz, it's a pop quiz. All my money coming clean, you can't pop this. She got that locked up like Lost Mill. Come to my lights like a reindeer. Me and Poppy on the same. My diamonds could never stand still. Where you going, can't come here. I'll always take you back for your. Come over good time, just a bad one. You say you want, give me something long time. Make you with this thing, what's something like crime. I make you see this. Are going to go down by quite a bit. That is going to wrap it up. December of 2007. So now I'm out of the agency 3.5 years. I got a call from Brian Ross at ABC News. And he said that he had a source who said I had tortured Abu Zubaydah. I said that was absolutely false. I was the only person who was kind to Abu Zubaydah. I said I've never laid a hand on Abu Zubaydah or any other prisoner. And he said, well, you're welcome to come on the show and defend yourself. Well, I had never spoken to a reporter before. I didn't know that was a reporter's trick. So I said, I'll think about it. In the meantime, President Bush, I remember it being a Monday, President Bush gives a press conference. And the International Committee of the Red Cross had said in a paper that the CIA was torturing prisoners. Human Rights Watch said CIA is torturing prisoners, and Amnesty International said CIA is torturing prisoners. So a reporter says, look, all these international human rights organizations are saying that the CIA is torturing its prisoners. What's your response to that? And the president looks right in the camera and he goes, we do not torture. Like that. And I said to my wife, who was a senior CIA officer, I said, he is a bald-faced liar. He's looking the American people right in the eye, and he's lying to us. And she said, are you surprised? Well, then on Wednesday, 2 days later, he gets a similar question. And he said that there is no torture. I knew he was lying. And then another 2 days later, it's Friday, and he's walking from the south portico of the White House to the helicopter to go to Camp David for the weekend. And a reporter shouts another question about torture. And this time he stops and he turns and he says, well, if there is torture, it's because of a rogue CIA officer. And I said to my wife, Brian Ross's sources at the White House, and they're going to pin this on me. So I called Brian Ross and I said, I'll give you your interview. And I decided in the whatever it was.
Why did you think they were going to pin it on you?
Because
they were calling you the human rights guy, so
yeah.
that you were going to be a patsy.
And I was not
you just
willing.
assumed that
I
was
assumed,
yeah. Because that's just your experience with the organization.
Oh yeah. They're going to leave somebody out to dry to protect themselves. So I called Brian Ross. I said, I'll give you your interview. And I decided that whatever he was going to ask me, and he never told me in advance what he was going to ask me, I was just going to tell the truth. And so he met me at the ABC News studios on DeSale Street in Washington. And I said three things in that interview that changed the course of the rest of my life. I said that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. I said that torture was official U.S. government policy. It was not the result of any rogue officer. And I said that the policy had been personally approved by the president himself. And then, as you can imagine, within 24 hours, the CIA files what's called a crimes report against me with the FBI, saying that I had revealed classified information. The FBI then investigates me from December of 07 to December of 08. And then they send my attorney a letter called a declination letter, declining to prosecute. They said that they had completed their investigation, that the information was already out there because of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Red Cross. But most importantly, torture is a crime, and it is illegal to classify a crime for the purpose of keeping it from the American people. So no charges. My wife and I went out to celebrate. That night we went to dinner. 3-4 weeks later, Barack Obama becomes president. And he names John Brennan, at first, CIA director. But the liberals went crazy because Brennan was one of the fathers of the torture program. Everybody seems to forget that now. And we can get into that if you want. But he then names Brennan the Deputy National Security Advisor for Counterterrorism. Brennan immediately sends a memo to Eric Holder, the new Attorney General, and says, talking about me, charge him with espionage. And Holder writes back, we got these memos in Discovery when I went to trial. Holder writes back and says, my people don't think he committed espionage. And then Brennan writes back and says, charge him anyway and make him defend himself. So they charged me with 5 felonies, 3 counts of espionage. They waited until I went bankrupt, and then they dropped the espionage charges. Yeah.
Sound familiar? At Mattress Firm, we understand there are many problems that can keep you up at night, like snoring, aches and pains, or sleeping hard. Ours.
Yeah.
Oh God, that's so gross.
That's Washington.
It's just so hard to believe that the United States of America government works like that. I believe it. I believe it.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to swallow.
There's a book by Harvey Silverglate, who's a professor of law at Harvard University. The book is called 3 Felonies a Day. And he says that we are so over-regulated, so over-criminalized in this country, that the average American, on the average day, going about his or her normal daily business, commits 3 felonies every single day. So if they want to get you, they're going to get you. And there's nothing you can do to protect yourself.
So what was Brennan's beef with you? Was it just because of the fact that you did that interview, or was there underlying tension?
We were never pals. I've known John Brennan for 35 years. We never really cared for each other. To tell you the truth, I thought the guy was in over his head intellectually. When I first started there, he was a deputy group chief. He was a GS-15, nobody, journeyman, first line, second line manager. No big deal. There are hundreds of them. And he worked for this really wonderful woman, a great intellect, named Martha Kessler. And Martha was so highly respected. She had written this book, I still remember the title, called Syria, Fragile Mosaic of Power. And when you got hired, you got her book, and you had to read the book. Because this is what we do. This is the perfect example of what we do. So he was her deputy. One day, he went to her, and he said, Martha, I've been your deputy for X number of years. I think I'm ready for promotion into the Senior Intelligence Service. And Martha said, and I just talked to her daughter a couple of weeks ago about this. Martha said, not only will you never be a member of the Senior Intelligence Service, I don't even want you working for me anymore. You're you're not really fired at the CIA. If you're fired, that means you have 6 weeks to walk the halls and find another job. If you can't find another job in 6 weeks, then they escort you to your car, they take your badge, and, so long. Good luck. Well, it's the normal job turnover is in the summertime. This is the week before Christmas, 1993 or 4, I can't recall now. And there are no jobs open at Christmas, so he finally finds one job. It is in the PDB staff, the President's Daily Brief, and it is as a morning briefer, giving the President's Daily briefing to the lowest ranking person entitled to a PDB briefing. So that's the National Security Council's Director for Intelligence Programs, who happened to be this guy named George Tenet. And so they immediately hit it off. 2 alpha dogs, cigar smoking, hard drinking. There used to be a kiosk right at the corner of 17th and Pennsylvania Avenue, adjacent to the White House, that sold cigars. Tenet had a heart attack and he wasn't supposed to smoke, and his wife would yell at him. So they would, after the briefing, they'd walk out to the kiosk and buy cigars and just stand there and laugh and, talk about chasing women or whatever. Totally hit it off. Then Tenet becomes the deputy director of the CIA. So he brings Brennan back with him and makes him Martha Kessler's boss, deputy director of the office that Martha's working in. He calls Martha Kessler in and says, "Now you're fired." And so she just elected to retire. Well, he ended up being identified by Tenet as the guy. Like, this is my guy. This guy's going places. He needs operational experience because he's been an analyst and an analytic manager all these years. I'm going to make him the station chief in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He's an analyst. He's never served overseas before. Never recruited a spy. Ever. It wasn't his job. Now all of a sudden he's the station chief in one of the most important stations in the world. So he does that for a long time. By the way, during which he approves the visas for the 9/11 hijackers. And then he comes back as the deputy executive director of the whole CIA. Right? So it's director, deputy director, executive director, and then the deputy directors for operations, intelligence, science, technology, administration. And they're dotted lines. So he's now one of the 5 most senior people in the entire CIA. He does that for a couple of years and then becomes the executive director. By the time I get promoted to be the morning briefer for the director and executive assistant, I'm throwing all these stupid terms out, executive assistant to the deputy director for operations, I'm meeting with Brennan every single day. So we're doing the Iraq War, we're doing terrorism, Al-Qaeda, and all this stuff. He didn't like me, and I didn't like him. And then when I became the quote, unquote, human rights guy, that just kind of sealed it for me. But I didn't care, because I didn't respect him anyhow. I will say that Jim Paddock, the deputy director for operations, legendary officer, and a really great guy, he hated Brennan more than I did. And he used to mock Brennan, because Brennan at the time was telling everybody, I want to head my own agency. I want to head my own agency. And they finally put him in charge of this thing that was temporarily called the TTIC, the Transnational Terrorism Information Center. It later became the National Counterterrorism Center. And they sort of shunted him off there. And it was a nothing analytic organization, not even in the headquarters building. It was out one of the outlying buildings. And then he kind of went away. But where he really did right for himself is in 2007 there was this wave of retirements, right? We're enough now beyond 9/11 that people can begin to retire. So this huge wave of senior level retirements in 2007. And then once these guys retired, half of them went to the McCain campaign and half of them went to the Hillary Clinton campaign. And John Brennan was literally the only one who went to the Obama campaign. And he saved himself.
Wow. My prize speaks a lot of just who?
Nice.
Dougie, nothing. Gotta celebrate.
That's not really what I was thinking. No.
Well, you got too many rings now. Winning just normal.
No, it's just like doing the research, making the right.
And he saved himself.
Wow. So, how did you wind up going to prison?
Well, as soon as Barack Obama became president, John Brennan decided he was going to have my head. And so he asked Holder to have the FBI grab me. And I'll tell you what, they knew they didn't have a case. So there's a little bit of background. From 2009 to the end of 2011, I was the senior investigator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, working for John Kerry. It was a terrible job. Kerry said, oh, I want you to do this and do that, and we're going to investigate this, investigate that, and then he would kill all the investigations because he wanted to be Secretary of State, and he didn't want to piss anybody at the White House off. So I can't talk about how Afghanistan produces 93% of the world's heroin, and all of it is because the CIA said they could. I can't talk about the Dashti Lele massacre, where 2,000 Taliban soldiers were suffocated to death in container trucks because the CIA didn't punch holes for them to breathe in the containers. Can't talk about any of that stuff because you want to be the Secretary of State. So I left in 2011. And right before I left, I got a call from a Japanese diplomat. And this is one of the things that I loved about that job, is this constant engagement with foreign diplomats. Like, who's doing what? And what do you think about Israel? What do you think about China? What do you think about what's going on in, Mexico or Cuba or whatever? And I get a call from this Japanese diplomat, and he invites me to lunch. And I said, great. We meet at a place on Capitol Hill. And I remember that lunch very well. I remember we talked about Israeli elections, we talked about Turkish elections, and we talked about the Arab-Israeli peace process. And at the end of the lunch, he says to me, and I should add, his English was so bad that we had to do the lunch in Arabic. So he said, what's next for you? And I said, well, I think I'm going to resign soon. I promised Senator Kerry I'd give him 2 years. It's been 2.5. I have 5 kids. And I really need to make some money and put my kids through college. And he goes, oh, no, don't do that. If you give me information, I can give you money. And I said, what the fuck is wrong with you? You have any idea how many times I've made that pitch? Shame on you, cold pitching me like that. And I got up indignantly, and I walked out. And I walked, and I mean directly, without stopping, to the office of the Senate Security Officer. And I knocked on the door, went in, I said, hey, I was just pitched by a foreign intelligence officer. And he goes, was it that damn Russian again? And I said, no, it was Japanese. He goes, Japanese? I said, I know, right? He goes, well, no, sometimes they poke around looking for trade information. I said, this didn't have anything to do with trade information. I don't think. I don't know. We didn't even get that far. He said, okay, do me a favor. He said, I've got a standalone computer here that's not connected to the internet. Write it up as a memo, and I'm going to courier it over to the FBI. So I sat there and I wrote the whole thing, blow by blow. The next day he calls me, and he says, 2 FBI agents are going to come up and talk to you. And I said, okay. So they come up, I recount the whole lunch, and they said, all right, here's what we want you to do. We want you to call him back, invite him to lunch, and then try to get him to tell you exactly what information he wants and how much he's willing to pay for it. And I said, because I'm a patriot, I said, you want me to wear a wire? And they said, no, we're going to be at the next table. We're going to listen to everything. I said, but he only speaks Arabic. That's okay. We got a guy who speaks Arabic, don't worry. I said, all right. So I call him, I invite him to lunch. We go to lunch, do the whole thing. But before the lunch, right before the lunch, they called and they said, operation came up, just write us another memo. Do the lunch and write us another memo. I said, fine. So I wrote another memo. They asked me to do it a 3rd time, a 4th time, and a 5th time. The 5th time, he says to me, I have great news. He said, I got my dream job. I've been promoted and I'm going to be the deputy ambassador in Cairo. And I said, congratulations. I shook his hand, never saw him again. So I've written all this to the FBI. One day in January of 2012, so I've been out of the Senate for about 9 months, the FBI calls. And I look at my cell phone, it says Federal Bureau of Investigation. I was like, I wonder what that's all about. So I answer, and they said, hey, you remember that thing you helped us out with a year ago? And I said, yeah. And they said, we've got a similar situation, and we need your help. And again, because I'm a patriot, I said, anything for the FBI. I kick myself now for saying it. I said, anything for the FBI. What do you want me to do? They said, come down to the Washington field office Thursday morning at 10. I said, done. I go down there the next Thursday, and they're waiting for me at the entrance, which I thought was odd. And we go up to a conference room, and they said, we're both cleared, SI, TK, Gamma, and then there were two compartments above top secret that I was cleared for that they said they were cleared for. And so if the conversation necessitated it, we could go into that area. So they said, well, before we start, just wanted to ask you, just read your book. It was great. I loved it. Hey, what about this that you said in your book? And I was like, yeah, okay. Yeah, it was a cool story. What about this other thing? Yeah, I had fun. I said, it was kind of hard. It took me 9 months to write the book, 22 months to get it cleared. Oh, yeah, you got it cleared. Yeah, of course I got it cleared. 22 months it took me to get it cleared. I'm thinking, what an odd question. Then they start asking me about something called the Sam Adams Project. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. And then the bad cop of the two says, we know you've been giving information to the Guantanamo defense attorneys. I said, what are you talking about? And then I said, wait a minute. Are you investigating me? And they said, yeah, and we're raiding your house right now as we speak. And I said, thank God. I said, I want to speak to my attorney right now. That was the only reason that they didn't arrest me. And one of the things that I learned, and this became painfully evident when they started arresting January 6th people, was the FBI in Washington likes to make its arrests on Thursdays. Because there are no federal arraignments on Friday. So you're in the DC jail Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night, getting the shit beaten out of you. And then they arraign you on Monday. And then you want to make a deal just so you don't ever have to go inside that prison again. But because I asked to see my attorney, they let me go. So I called the attorney as soon as I got out of the office. Actually, when I was walking out, one of them went over to, I didn't know it at the time, but it was Peter Strzok. And Peter Strzok says, tell me he implicated himself. And the guy said, not really, no. We have to let him go. And so I grabbed my cell phone and I left, went to the attorney's office. They had already called my attorney and said they were charging me with espionage. I hadn't committed espionage. They knew I hadn't committed espionage. And in fact, since then, I'm fast forwarding a lot, 3 FBI agents have reached out to me, well, 2 to my attorneys. One reached out to me directly to apologize, saying that this came from the top. They thought it was a BS case. They were sorry they were involved, but there was nothing they could do. One guy reached out to me through eBay, of all things, like to try to cover up the trail. He's like, listen, I've been losing sleep over this for the last 13 years. I just wanted to tell you how sorry I am. Blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, I hope you feel better. My whole life fell apart. But I'm glad you got that off your chest. So, it became a matter of just survival after that. You know, you have to take it seriously. I was facing 45 years in prison. And then when the Justice Department made a request for a proffer meeting, the proffer meeting is they'll give you a little idea of what they have against you, and then they make an offer. You can take it or leave it. And they offered me 45 years. And I said, I'm not doing 45 minutes. I didn't do anything wrong. And this woman, she became Deputy Attorney General for the Criminal Division under Biden. She said, take this deal, Mr. Kiriakou, and you may live to meet your grandchildren. Oh, it was... I went home that night, and I went home. I'm ashamed to even say it. That night, we put the kids to bed. And my wife and I were watching TV, and she said, come on, let's go to bed. I said, I can't sleep. There's no way I'm going to be able to sleep. And she said, no, come on, let's go to bed. She knew I was going to go down into the garage, turn the car on, and just lay across the back seat. And she said, no, come on. You need to try to get some sleep. And she saved me that night. But 45 years? And so they waited 10 months before they were even willing to engage in a conversation. And then they offered 10 years on a Monday. On Wednesday, they offered 8. And on Friday, they offered 5. My lead attorney was this legendary guy named Plato Kacharis. And Plato said, you know, I've been a criminal defense attorney in this city for 52 years. And this is the first time I've ever seen them come down in time. He said, usually they offer you 10, you say no, the next offer's 15, then the next offer's 20. I said, why are they coming down in time? He said, because they have a shit case and they know it's shit. And that's why we're going to go to trial and we're going to win this thing. I said, great. Well, they stayed at 5. And then they came back and they said, 3.5. And I said, I'm going to trial. I'm going to win this thing. Turned out, at the time, my best friend, his wife, had an uncle who was O.J. Simpson's jury consultant. And she called him for me. She said, hey, my friend John, he's in this situation. He's like, yeah, I read about this in the papers. He could use your help. He came up, didn't charge me a cent. He came up to Washington. We got him a security clearance, and which was another thing. We asked for a security clearance, and then the Justice Department called and said, the White House said Kiriakou's attorneys have enough security clearances. And I said, who at the White House said we have enough security clearances? Well, they had to tell us. It was John Brennan. No more attorneys for Kiriakou. Fisher cut bait. We're like, it's not up to John Brennan to decide if I have enough attorneys. You know, they have an unlimited number of attorneys, an unlimited budget. As it turned out, they spent $6 million to put me in prison. Was society really better off spending $6 million to put me in a low-security prison for 23 months? So, in the end, they said, best and final offer, 30 months, you do 23. Well, I was only the second American who had ever been charged with this crime of violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1982. The only other person that was charged with it was a woman named Sharon Scranage. She was a CIA secretary in Ghana in the 80s. And she was having an affair with a member of Ghana's intelligence service. And in the course of pillow talk, she revealed the names of all of the CIA officers in the station and the names of the sources they were running. And so the names executed these guys. She got 9 months in prison. 9 months. And they offered me 45 years.
High positions on pro football playoffs and the Pro Football Championship with Robinhood. Download Robinhood.
Google still tracks you in incognito mode. Use DuckDuckGo, a real private browser.
For blowing the whistle on the torture program. So, my wife and I stayed up all night, literally all night. And because Sharon Scranage had taken a plea, there was literally no case law. So what we found several things. We found several articles from the Harvard Law Review saying this law is unconstitutional. It violates the First Amendment, and it is prior restraint, right? Like it tells you in advance you can't say X, Y, and Z. But because there was no case law, you couldn't challenge it in court. And I said, well, can't we just appeal the charge? And maybe, all the way up to the Supreme Court? And they said, yeah, we can do that